Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 20, so let's get into it. Chapter 20. The house at Mers was the best thing that had ever happened to Julia in her entire life. In any of her entire lives. Pouncey was right. She had come home. Her life up until now had been one vicious, unfun, never-ending game of tag, where everyone else was it, and you could never stop running. Only now had she finally found home base. She could rest. Unlike the safe houses, this house was actually safe. This was her break bills, for real this time. She had made a separate piece. There were 10 people at Mers, counting Julia. Some were from Free Trader Beowulf, some weren't. Pouncey was there, and Asmodeus, and Failstaff. So were Gummidgee and Fiberpunk, timid and frequent posters who were the last people Julia would have figured were involved with magic. Now she realized they'd probably spent most of their time trading spells and private threads. Asmodeus and Failstaff and Pouncey weren't who she thought they were at all. She'd figured Pouncey for a girl or a gay man, but she didn't get a gay vibe off him in person, and either way, she didn't think he'd be so good-looking. Online, he came across as somebody with something to be angry about, who was always on the edge of losing it in the face of some intolerable outrage against his person, and who kept it together through sheer force of will. Julia's pet theory had been that he was an accident victim of some kind, a paraplegic maybe, or somebody in chronic pain who was struggling to be philosophical about his condition. No way she would have pegged him as all Abercrombie and Fitch like that. Failstaff wasn't handsome. In Julia's mind, he'd been a silver-haired retiree, a gentleman of the old school. In fact, he was about 30, and he might have been a gentleman, but if he was one of the largest gentlemen she'd ever seen. 6'5", maybe, and built like a boot. He wasn't fat, exactly. There was just a shitload of him. He must have weighed 400 pounds. His voice was a subsonic rumble. As for Asmodeus, she turned out to be even younger than Julia, 17 at the most, a fast talker with a big smile and heavy V-shaped eyebrows that gave her a naughty schoolgirl look. She had a bit of a Fairuza Balk thing going on, shades of The Craft. They were her best friends, and Julia didn't even recognize them. They were also magicians, and good ones, better than she was. And they lived in a big house in the south of France. It would take her a while to get used to them, and to forgive them. "When were you going to tell me?" she demanded, as she sat ranged around some deep glasses of local red at a stylish reclaimed wood table on the stone patio behind the house. A blue swimming pool shimmered in the late afternoon sun. It was like a goddamn cigarette ad. "Really, I'd like to know. You were here all this time doing magic and scarfing humane local foie gras, and I don't even know what else. And you didn't even tell me? Instead, you made me pass a test, another test, as if I haven't passed enough tests in my life." Maddeningly, a tear coursed down her cheek. She snapped her hand to her face like she'd been stung. "Julia." You could practically feel it when Failstaff talked. His voice was that deep. It practically rattled the silverware. "We're sorry," Asmodeus said, all sisterly. "We all went through it. Believe me, it gave us no pleasure to think about you at that Bedstoy safe house." Pouncy set his wine glass aside. But think about it. When you dropped off the radar on FTB, we had a pretty good sense that you'd hooked up with the magic scene. So we waited. We gave you time to get your feet under you, get the basics out of the way, all that low-level crap. Get your finger positions straight, crack the major language groups, to see if this was for you or not. Well, thanks a fucking million. That was really thoughtful of you. All that time she'd spent wandering in the wilderness, wondering if there was anything out there, and they'd been here this whole time, watching her. She took a shaky breath. You don't know what I've been through. We know, Falstaff said. She looked at them, sipping their wine, a fancy Rhone red, so dark it was almost black, lolling in the golden fucking merchant ivory sunlight. The house was surrounded by hayfields gone to seed. They seemed to absorb sound, leaving them alone in an ocean of hush. You were paying your dues, Pouncy said. Call it a rite of passage. Let's call it what it is, Julia said. You were testing me. Who do you think you are to test me? Yes, we fucking tested you, Pouncy was exasperated, but in a decorous, good-natured way. You would have done the same thing to us. We tested the shit out of you, not to see if you were smart. We know you're smart. You're a goddamn genius. Though, Iris says your old church Slavonic is crap. But we had to know why you were here. It wouldn't work if you were just here to play with us. It wasn't enough for you to love us. You had to love magic. We all did it, Julia, Asmodeus repeated. Everybody here did, and we were all pissed when we found out the truth, and we all got over it. Julia snorted. You're what, 17? Are you going to tell me you paid your dues? I paid, Julia, she said evenly. A challenge. And to answer your question, Pouncy said, who do we think we are? We are us. And you're one of us now, and we're damn glad you're here. But we don't take chances on people. He waited for that to sink in. There's too much at stake. Julia crossed her arms fiercely, or with all the ferocity she could muster, to avoid giving them the impression that they were entirely forgiven. But God damn them all to Hades. She was curious. She wanted to know what the hell this place was, and what they were up to. She wanted to know what the game was, so she could play too. So, whose house is this? She said. Who paid for all this? Obviously, there was a lot of money washing around here. She'd stood by while Pouncy called the rental car company and, in fluent French, simply bought the scrapped-up Pinoy with a credit card. It's Pouncy's, Asmodeus said. Mostly. He was a day trader for a while. He was pretty good at it. Pretty good? Pouncy lifted his finely drawn eyebrows. Asmo shook her head. If you'd gone into the math just a little further, you could have done so much better. I keep telling you, if you look at the market as a chaotic system. Whatever. It wasn't an interesting problem. It was a means to an end. If you'd just stake me. We all put in money when we came here, Falstaff said. I put in all mine. What was I saving for? What else is money for except to live like this, with them, somewhere like Mers? No offense, but it all sounds kind of culty. That's exactly what it is, Asmodeus said, clapping her hands. The cult of Pouncy. I think of it more like CERN, Pouncy said. It's an institute for high-energy magical studies. Julia hadn't touched her wine. More than wine right now, she wanted control. A thing that was not fully compatible with wine. So, I'm looking around for like a large Hadron Collider, or its magical equivalent. Bup, Pouncy said. Baby steps. First, we power level you up to 250, and then we shall see what we shall see. It emerged that the house at Mers was, in its way, a natural outgrowth of the safe house scene. The scene was a filter. It caught a very few rather unusual people, culled them out of the everyday world and into the safe houses, and gave them magic to chew on. Mers filtered the filtered, double distilled them. Most people in the magic scene were happy, chilling in the safe houses, foffing around with three-ring binders. It was a social thing for them. They liked the double life aspect of it. They'd gone behind the veil. They liked knowing they had a secret. It was what they needed, and it was all they needed. But some people, a very few people, were different. Magic meant something else to them. Something more primal and urgent. They didn't have a secret. The secret had them. They wanted more. They wanted to penetrate the veil beyond the veil. They did not foff. They learned. And when they hit the ceiling of what they could learn in the safe house scene, they banged on it till somebody in the attic opened up a trap door. That's when they ended up in Mers. Pouncey and his gang skimmed off the cream of the safe houses and brought them here. Life was easy in Mers, at least at first. There was a living wing and a working wing. Julia was assigned a beautiful bedroom with a high ceiling and wide floorboards and big stripy curtained windows that let in floods of that champagne-y French light. Everybody cooked and everybody cleaned, but they'd worked out a lot of magic to smooth the way. It was amazing to watch the floors repel dust and herd it into neat little piles, like iron fillings in a magnetic field. And the produce was second to none. The others didn't welcome her with other arms exactly. They weren't open arms types. But there was respect there. She was geared up to prove herself all over again, since based on her life thus far, she was used to having to prove herself to a new gang of assholes every 6 months or so. And she would have. She really would have. But they weren't going to make her. The proving was done with. The journey was the test, and she had arrived. She was in. It wasn't Breakbills. It was better. She felt like she'd finally won. She'd won ugly, but she'd won. They knew about Breakbills at Mers. Not much, but they knew. Their attitude toward it was bracingly snobbish. They considered Breakbills, to the extent that they considered it at all, rather cute. A sanitized, safety-wheeled playpen for those who didn't have the grit and the will to make it on the outside. They called it fake bills and break balls. At Breakbills, you sat in classrooms and followed the rules. Perfectly fine if you like that kind of thing. But here at Mers, you made your own rules. No adult supervision. Breakbills was the Beatles. Mers was the Stones. Breakbills was for marquee of Queensbury types. Mers was more your stone-cold street-fighting man. Most of them had even been in for the Breakbills exam like her, though, unlike her, they didn't realize that till they'd gotten to Mers and Failstaff, who had a special touch with memory spells, had wafted away the magic that was fogging their brains. They took a certain pride in it, the Fuseniks. Gummidgee, Julia never did figure out what the deal with her name was, even claimed to have beaten the exam and then, a historic first, declined Fogg's offer to matriculate and walked away. She'd chosen the life of a hedge witch instead. Privately, Julia thought that was completely demented and that the Breakbills crowd probably had slightly more on the ball than the others were giving them credit for. But she enjoyed the snobism nonetheless. She'd earned that much. They were an odd bunch at Mers. It was a menagerie. You needed a genius IQ to get into Mers, but eccentricity was not an impediment. And you'd have to be some kind of outlier to go through the grinder of the safe house scene and not come out a little skewy. A lot of their magic was home brewed, and as a result, the range of different styles and techniques on display was bewildering. Some of them were graceful and balletic. Some were so minimalist they barely moved at all. One guy was so herky-jerky he looked like he was practically breakdancing. There was some popping and locking going on there. There were specialists, too. One guy mostly made magic artifacts. Gummidgee was a dedicated psychic. Fiberpunk, a short, thick-set specimen, almost as wide as he was tall, self-identified as a metamagician. He dealt in magic that acted on other magic, or on itself. He rarely spoke and spent a lot of time drawing. The one time Julia looked over his shoulder, he explained in a whisper that he was drawing two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional shadows cast by four-dimensional objects. Life was easy in Mers, but work was hard. They gave her a day to deal with her jet lag and her personal baggage. Then Pouncey told her to report to the East Wing first thing in the morning. Julia didn't fancy being told to report anywhere by Pouncey Silverkitten, whom she was accustomed to thinking of as a friend and an equal. But he just unbuttoned his shirt and showed her his stars. Also, his annoyingly smooth, well-muscled chest. He had a lot of them. Equals they might be, but only in some abstract philosophical sense. Practically speaking, he could still kick her ass at magic. Which was why, swallowing her pride and possibly some other feelings, she obeyed Pouncey and reported to an upstairs room in the East Wing called the Long Study at 8 o'clock in the morning. The Long Study was a narrow room lined with windows along one side. More of a gallery, really. There was nothing obvious to study with there. There were no books, no desks, or furniture of any kind in the Long Study. What there was Iris. Baby-faced, chop-sticked hair, Ivy League Iris. Last seen breaking Julia down into her component parts back at the Bedstoy safe house. It was almost like meeting an old friend. On her home turf, Iris went casual, jeans and a white t-shirt that showed off her stars. "Hi," Julia said. It came out a tad querulous. She cleared her throat and tried again. "How are you?" "Let's do it again," Iris said, from the top. "Start with the Flash." "The Flash?" "We're going to run your levels. Start with the Flash. You miss one, you go back to the beginning. You do them all, 1 to 77, no mistakes, 3 times in a row, and then we can start work." "You mean start leveling me?" "Start with the Flash." For Iris, meeting Julia again was not like meeting an old friend. For Iris, meeting Julia was more like when the grizzled sergeant in the Vietnam movie meets the newbie private fresh from Paris Island. Eventually, the private will lose his cherry and become a man, but first, the sergeant is going to have to drag him through the jungle until such time as the private can unfold his untrenching tool without shooting his balls off. Of course, Iris had every right. That's how the system worked. She was doing Julia a fucking favor. Babysitting the noob was evidently not considered a premium assignment at Mers, and she wasn't going to pretend to enjoy it. Which, whatever, but this did not oblige Julia to pretend to be grateful either. Really, she ought to dog it a few times, she thought, just to piss Iris off. Show her that Julia had nothing to prove. See how long it took her to lose her shit. Isk. Her and her Flash. But in truth, it was not necessary for Julia to dog it. She screwed it up the old-fashioned way, involuntarily 4 times, before she made it to 77, even once. Twice, she muffed the same spell. Level 56, a thumb-cracking affair rich in Welsh twos that was designed to toughen glass against breakage. Even averaging a bit more than 2 minutes a level, which was really machine-like efficiency. They were 2.5 hours into it when she went down for the second time. Iris sat down cross-legged on the floor. But Julia had decided that she was not going to swear or twitch or sigh in front of Iris, whether she muffed level 56 twice or 200 times. She was going to be all sweetness and light. How do you like them apples? At 2 in the afternoon, Julia spiked spell number 68 on an otherwise perfect run-through. Iris rolled her eyes and groaned and lay down full length on the wooden floor and stared up at the ceiling. She couldn't even look at Julia anymore. Julia didn't pause, but went right back to the beginning. Whereupon, she stuffed level 14. A gimme spell that even Jared knew cold. God, Iris shouted at the ceiling. Get it right! By the time Julia rattled off 2 perfect runs, right through to 77, it was 6:30 in the evening. They hadn't broken for lunch. Julia hadn't even sat down. The setting sun angled in front of the west, painted the long wall a chalky pink. Her feet were killing her. All right, Iris said. That's it. Same time tomorrow? But we're not done. Iris levered herself up off the floor. Nope, we're done. Finish tomorrow. We're not done. Iris stopped and stared at Julia through her nerd glasses. Maybe Iris was annoyed at having to babysit the new fish, but Julia had so much more anger than Iris did at her disposal. She was making a withdrawal from her stockpile now, spending a little off the principal, and it hardly made a dent. She walked over to a window and punched it. It would have broken if she hadn't already cast level 56 on it 3 times that day. All right, Julia, I get it. I was tough on you. I'm sorry. Come on, let's get some dinner. We're done when I say we're done. Julia cast a locking spell on the door, level 72. It was a symbolic gesture, as there were, in fact, 2 doors out of the long study, and Iris could probably have unpicked her level 72 in a couple of minutes anyway. That wasn't the point. The point was that Julia had been waiting 4 years to get to Mers. Iris could skip dinner. Iris sat back down and put her head in her hands. Whatever. She could stand to skip a few meals anyway, Julia thought. She's working on a muffin top situation with those jeans. Julia started again. She was going slower now, and when she was done, the room was dark. It was almost 9 o'clock. Iris stood up. She tried the door Julia had locked, swore, and walked the length of the long study to the other door without looking back or saying a word. Julia watched her go. There was no touching moment of female bonding. The grizzled sergeant didn't chuck her on the shoulder and grudgingly admit that the rookie might make a hell of a soldier one day after all. But when she reported to the long study at 8 o'clock the following morning, it was tactfully understood that they could now skip the alpha chick bullshit. Let the power leveling begin. Here come the big secrets. At least she didn't have to fuck anybody this time. She didn't have to stand up either. Apparently, she now qualified for some furniture. She and Iris sat on chairs and faced each other across an actual table, a sturdy chunk of old butcher block. On the table was, yes, a 3-ring binder, but it was the most beautiful 3-ring binder Julia had ever seen. Leather-bound with those sturdy steel rings, none of this bendy aluminum trapper keeper shit. And above all, thick, thick, thick. It was stuffed with neatly transcribed spells. Under Iris's steady gaze, Julia went up 2 levels that day. The next day, she did 5. Entry level, she gained, wiped out a little bit of what she'd been through in Brooklyn. Every level she gained wiped out a little bit of what she'd been through in Brooklyn. Julia had a hungry mind. She always had, and she'd been on starvation rations for longer than she cared to think about. She'd been worried that her brain might be starving to death, losing its plasticity. That she'd been running on fumes for so long, she might not have the mental muscle tone to wrangle large tranches of hard data. But she didn't think so. If anything, wandering in the information jungle had made her tough and efficient. She was used to doing a lot with a little. Now that she had a lot, she was going to work wonders with it, and she did. It was frustrating having to pound levels while the others were off doing God knew what. She was running through new fields of power, frisking through them, but she was already eager to get on to whatever it was the rest of them were up to. She kept trying to run ahead, and Iris had to drag her back and make her trudge through the levels in order. I mean, it was so blindingly obvious that if you took the kinetic elements from level 112 and borrowed the reflexive bits from the self-warming spell at level 44, then you had a basic working model for how to make yourself hover a few feet off the ground. But that wasn't till 166, and level 166 was 54 more levels away. And meanwhile, she was being treated like a little kid around whom everybody had to watch their language. Whenever she looked out the window of the long study, it seemed like Pouncy and Asmodeus were walking by, heatedly engaging in what was obviously the most interesting conversation in the history of spoken communication. Either they were sleeping together, though even in France Asmodeus was practically jailbait, so whatever, or there was some deal going on here that Julia was not yet senior enough to be cut in on. Conversations went quiet whenever she walked into the dining room. It's not that they weren't glad to see her, it's just that she had apparently developed the ability to instantly make people forget what they'd been about to say, causing them instead to make some remark about the weather or the coffee or Asmo's eyebrows. One night she woke up from a dead sleep at 2 a.m. She was so tired from running levels with Iris that she'd gone straight up to her room and slept through dinner. At first, she thought there was a phone ringing in her room on vibrate, except that she didn't have a phone. Then the vibrations got stronger than that, stronger and stronger to the point where the whole house was throbbing every 5 seconds or so. It sounded like when cars rolled down her street in Brooklyn with the bass cranked up and too much funk in the trunk. Things were starting to rattle. It was like giant footsteps were approaching the house over the sleeping fields of Mers. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes. The pulses got bigger and bigger until whatever it was right on top of her. The windows rattled till she thought the old glass would crack. On the final beat, her bed vibrated a foot to the left, and she could feel 300-year-old plaster dust sift down from the ceiling onto her face. Somewhere in the house, something did shatter, a window or a plate. Light burst soundlessly out of the lower floors of the house, illuminating the row of cypresses across the lawn. And then it was gone, just like that. Leaving behind it only a ringing, burnt-out silence. Later, it might have been an hour later, she heard the others coming up to bed. Asmo said something in a furious whisper, something about how they were wasting their time, and somebody else shushed her. The next morning, everything was as it had been. Nobody copped to anything having happened at all, though Fiberpunk was now sporting a ripe purple bruise on his temple. When Julia hit level 200, they baked her a cake. 2 weeks later, 6 weeks after she'd driven into Mers, she went to bed having hit level 248, and she knew that tomorrow would be it. And it was. At 3 in the afternoon, Iris walked her through a complex casting that, when properly done, rolled back entropy in a local area by 5 seconds. The effect was very local, a circle a yard across, but no less spectacular for that. The theory behind it was a rat's nest of interwoven effects. She could hardly believe something that kludgy even worked, but Iris could do it, and after a few hours so could Julia. She knocked down a pile of blocks. She cast the spell. The blocks knocked themselves back up again. And that was level 250. When she dropped her hands, Iris kissed her on both cheeks, "So franish," and told her they were finished. She could hardly believe it. Just to be sure, she offered to run the full set, 1 through 250, to Iris's satisfaction, but Iris declined. She'd seen enough. Julia spent the rest of the afternoon just walking the shady lanes that ran in comforting right angles between the sun-baked fields that surrounded the farmhouse. Her brain felt bloated and replete. Like after a big meal. It was the first time she could ever remember it not being hungry. She spent an hour playing computer games. Then that night, Fiberpunk cooked them an elaborate bouillabaisse with monkfish and saffron, and they opened a bottle of Chateaubriand du Pape with dust on its shoulders and a really boring-looking label that didn't even have a little line drawing on it, which meant it must have been hair-raisingly expensive. Before they went to bed, Pouncey told her to come to the library the next morning. Not the long study, the library. She woke up early. It was midsummer, but the heat hadn't come up yet. She haunted the lumpy, unlandscaped grounds for an hour, startling weird French bugs out of her way, studying the tiny white snails that were everywhere, getting her shoes soaked with dew, waiting for everybody else to wake up. It was like morning on her birthday. Superstitiously, Julia avoided the dining room while the others ate breakfast. At 7:55, she snatched a roll out of the kitchen and gnawed it nervously on her way over to the library. The day she'd stepped into that elevator in the library in Brooklyn, she dropped into the void. It might as well have been an empty shaft. She'd been falling ever since, but it was almost over. She was about to touch solid ground again. She could barely even remember what it felt like to be where she belonged, on the same side of the glass as everybody else. She'd tried the door to the library once before, but it hadn't opened for her, and she hadn't bothered trying to hack the locking charm. She was tired of picking locks. She stood in front of the door for a minute, plucking at the fabric of her summer dress, watching the second hand of the clock in the hall. At the appointed hour, the door opened by itself. Julia lowered her chin and went inside. They were all there, sitting around a long work table. The library was clearly the crowning achievement of whoever had renovated the Mers farmhouse. They'd hollowed out the space completely, cut away 3 floors, and exposed the roof beams 30 feet up. Morning sunlight lasered in through tall thin windows. Bookshelves soared along the walls, all the way up, which would have been totally impractical except for some tasteful oak platforms that floated magically alongside them, ready to hoist the browser up to whatever level he or she wanted to be at. They stopped talking when she came in. 9 faces turned to look up at her. Some of them had books and folders of notes in front of them. They could have been a corporate board meeting if the corporation were Random Genius Freaks LLC. Pouncey sat at the head of the table. There was an open seat at the foot. She pulled out the chair and sat down almost demurely. Why weren't they talking? They just looked at her calmly, like a parole board. So, she'd met their expectations. It was time they met hers. Cards on the table, show me what you got. Read 'em and weep. All right, she said. So what are we doing? What would you like to do? It wasn't Pouncy who spoke. It was Gummidgee. You tell me, Julia. Julia wanted to say. You're the psychic. She was built like a model, tall and skinny, though her face was too long and severe to be really beautiful. Julia couldn't place her ethnicity. Persian? Whatever comes next. Whatever comes after 250. 251, I'm ready. What makes you think there is a level 251? Her eyes narrowed. The fact that there were levels 1 through 250? There are no level 251. Julia looked at Pouncy, Falstaff, Osmodeus. They looked back at her patiently. Asmo nodded. How can there be no level 251? There's nothing after 250, Pouncy said. Oh, you can craft more spells. We do it all the time. But at this point, you have all the building blocks, all the basic components that you're going to have. The rest is just permutations. After 250, you're just rearranging base pairs on the double helix. The power levels plateau. Julia had a weightless, floating feeling. Not a bad feeling, but like she'd been cut adrift. So this was it. As mysteries went, it wasn't exactly a showstopper. That's it? That's all there is? That's it. You're done leveling. Well, you could do a lot with what she had. She already had some ideas about spells involving extreme temperatures, extreme states of matter, plasmas, Bose-Einstein, condensates, that sort of thing. She didn't think she'd ever been tried. Maybe Pouncy would front her some money for equipment. So that's what you're doing here? Running the permutations? No, that's not what we're doing. Though we have run a hell of a lot of permutations, Asmo put in. She took over the narrating. Once we realized that the way forward consisted of an indefinite series of incremental advances, we began to wonder if there was an alternative to that, a way to break the cycle, to take the power curve non-linear. Non-linear? Julia said slowly. You want to find a magical singularity kind of thing? Exactly. Osmodeus grinned her wide Cheshire grin at Pouncy, as if to say, see, I told you she'd get it. A singularity, an advance so radical that it takes us into another league, power-wise, exponentially bigger energies. We think there's more to magic than what we've seen so far, Pouncy said. A lot more. We think we're just dicking around in the minors, while there's power sources out there that could put us on in the bigs, if we could just access the right power grid. So that's what you're doing here, trying to get on the big power grid? She realized she was repeating their words while her mind tried to take in what they meant. So there was more to it. Funny. She had almost been relieved for a minute there, when she thought that was it. That was all there was. She'd crammed a lifetime's worth of magical study into the last 4 years, and the rest of her, the non-magical parts, was feeling somewhat neglected, empty. She wouldn't have minded spending some time filling in those blanks in a big French farmhouse with some close friends. The big energies could wait. Or they could have. But her close friends didn't want to wait, and Julia would go with them because, and it was so painfully tender to say it, even to herself, that she didn't say it, even to herself. She loved them. They were what she had instead of a family. So Excelsior, onward and upward. That's what we're doing here. Pouncy sat back and laced his hands behind his head. It was early, but there were already dark patches of sweat under his arms. Unless you have any better ideas. Julia shook her head. Everybody was watching her. All right, she said. Well, show me what you've got so far. read 'em and weep. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with chapter 21.